Hello friends, and welcome to the Animal Nerd Podcast. We made it to our second episode. What an incredible achievement. I mean, I'm basically an expert at this thing now. I am, once again, your podcast host and animal aficionado, and I am so happy that you are here. For today's episode, we're travelling back in time to the early 20th century to share the story of an incredible animal who not only became famous, but also had a lasting effect on science that's still relevant to this day. Okay, so picture the scene. It's the late summer of 1904, and everyone who's anyone is flocking to Berlin to see the celebrity who's been taking Germany by storm. And it's not just Germans. This celebrity's fame has reached far beyond their own country's borders, to bring in fans from as far afield as the United States, where he was featured twice in the New York Times. When you picture the kind of place an international celebrity would live, even in the early 1900s, you probably don't picture a small courtyard in northern Berlin surrounded by an apartment building. But that's where Kluge Hans, or Clever Hans if you don't speak German, lives and performs. And who is Clever Hans? Well, he's a horse, of course, but not just any horse. Clever Hans was, as his name implies, far more intelligent than your average horse. He could perform maths equations far more complicated than I could ever manage. He could read and spell and understand spoken German perfectly. He could recognise different colours and pick them out if asked. He could tell the time from a watch and had memorised the annual calendar. He was doing things that no other horse, no other animal, had ever been known to do before. He was incredible. Of course, there were people who claimed to have animals like horses and dogs trained to count and perform similar feats to Hans in the past. They were actually a popular vaudeville act at the time, but in every one of those cases, all it took was one person who knew what they were looking for to debunk it as nothing but a fraud, a trained animal performing a trick. But that wasn't the case with Hans. He really seemed to understand what he was saying. Any number of experts in the field, professional equestrians, zoologists, circus trainers, cavalrymen, would go to Hans's daily exhibitions as hardened skeptics, convinced that they would be the ones to prove that this was all an elaborate hoax, only to come out of it convinced that Hans really was all that he was claimed to be. There was no training, no tricks, nothing. Hans was asked questions, and he answered them with an accuracy rate of about 90%. But before we get too into Hans's celebrity status and his achievements, let's go back to the beginning. Hans was a bay or love trotter. We don't know his exact birthday, but we know it was probably somewhere in 1895. When he was only a colt, he was purchased by a Mr. Vilhelm Von Austin, a retired maths teacher and something of an eccentric. He was a man in his 60s, with long white hair and an equally long white beard. If you picture a slightly unkempt wizard, that's kind of the vibe, and in fact he was said to be a bit of a mystic. Von Austin was the kind of person who became easily obsessed, and his interests were all on the slightly strange side, shall we say. One of his big passions was phrenology, the idea that you can tell a person's personality traits and mental capabilities just by measuring the bumps in their skull. It's absolute pseudoscience, and has been debunked by experts more times than anyone can count. And in fact, it had already been discredited as an idea over half a century before the story takes place. But Vilhelm von Austin was not the kind of guy to let a little something like a total lack of scientific evidence get in the way of his ideas. And one of these ideas was to teach a horse to think and communicate like a human. Hans was actually von Austin's second attempt at this, as sadly the first horse he tried this with had passed away 3 years into training. But if von Austin wasn't going to let science and logic stop him, then he certainly wasn't going to let his horse dying do the same. So he purchased Hans. And okay, I know what you're wondering. How the hell do you teach a horse to do maths or anything like that? Well, fortunately for us, von Austin was very open about his techniques. Obviously, the first issue was the fact that horses don't communicate in the same language as humans, which von Austin decided to overcome by teaching Hans to tap his hoof to count numbers and spell out words. Hans's education started with a set of large wooden pins, the kind you'd use for bowling. Von Austin would place a single one of these pins in front of Hans and tell him, "Raise the foot! 1! I mean, obviously he said it in German, but if I tried to do that, it would just be painful for everyone involved. I have a feeling I'm going to struggle enough with trying to get some of the names in this story right without adding extra German into the mix. So anytime I'm quoting anyone or anything, just know that it's been translated. I mean, that's probably obvious, but just in case. But anyway, after telling Hans to tap once, von Austin would then help Hans out by holding onto his hoof and guiding the movement, and this little series would be repeated over and over again until Hans understood what was required of him. And every time he did the right thing, he was rewarded with a carrot or a slice of bread. Once Hans had mastered the concept of 1, he moved on to the dizzying heights of the number 2. The process was basically the same. Von Austin would set up 2 pins and tell Hans to count them. In one hand, he held Hans's hoof to guide the tapping, and in the other he pointed each pin out in turn as he did so. 1, 2, and so on and so forth. Whenever a new pin was added, von Austin would count up to that number to ensure that Hans was learning the proper numerical order. The process for every number was the same as the one I've already mentioned, just obviously with an extra one added each time, and I'm not going to bore you by going over it again and again, since most of you probably already know how to count. Gradually, as Hans began to understand what his owner wanted from him, he no longer needed the help to tap or to have the numbers counted out individually. But of course, von Austin had once been a maths teacher, and it wasn't enough for Hans to just know the numbers if he didn't also know how to use them in equations. So, with the use of an abacus, von Austin taught him addition and then subtraction, multiplication, division, and, well, you get the point. Look, we've all been to school and learnt this stuff ourselves, and Hans' schooling used pretty much the same techniques throughout, so I'm not going to go over every single thing he was taught, since it's hardly the most interesting part of the story. Oscar Funkst wrote a book about this whole thing with the very catchy name of Clever Hans, the Horse of Mr. Von Austin, a contribution to experimental animal and human psychology, which features a section that goes in depth into Von Austin's teaching methods, if you want the really nitty-gritty details, or I guess if you want to teach your own horse to do this. But fair warning if you do, the book is a bit of a slog to get through at points. I read the whole thing as part of my research for this episode, and while some of it is really interesting, a lot of it is just like very detailed descriptions of repetitive tests and experiments, and the teaching section is very similar. I'm kind of hoping that maybe in this episode I can cut out a lot of the more boring stuff and just include the interesting bits and the general story without getting too bogged down in the minutiae. So there's an alternative for people who want to learn Clever Hans' story without it being too tedious. Although me saying all of this is probably going to make it quite tedious, so let's go back to the story. Once he felt that Hans was educated enough, Von Austin began to exhibit Hans to the people of Berlin, in that same courtyard where the horse was kept. In fact, it's kind of a sad fact that's just brushed over in most sources, but Hans spent pretty much his entire life in this one small courtyard. He was sometimes allowed to run free in the courtyard. In fact, he often wasn't restrained at all during exhibitions, but from what I can tell, the entire place was paved, meaning that he never got to experience something as basic as grazing in his time with Von Austin, which is honestly just sad. Von Austin said he taught Hans in the same way he'd teach a human child, and it really does seem that a lot of Hans' equine nature and needs were just ignored. That being said, though, Von Austin was also more ahead of his time than most equestrians in the early 1900s, in that he never once used a whip on Hans, or any other kind of punishment. I do need to mention, in case people shout at me, a whip doesn't necessarily have to be used as a form of punishment with horses. Lunge whips especially are just used as extensions of the arm. Whips can be used in a way that doesn't harm a horse, although unfortunately even now, some people do still use them in a way that does. And that was something that was even more common back when this story took place. Now, the idea of exhibiting a quote-unquote educated horse wasn't necessarily a new one. As I said earlier, they were actually a popular vaudeville act in this time, with one particularly famous example being a mare named Clever Rosa. Yeah, apparently that was just like the naming convention for any horse who could do maths. Just keep the name but put Clever in front of it. I mean, I wouldn't complain, I'd like to be known as clever. Unfortunately, I'm not, and I can't do maths. Hence why I spend my spare time talking about animals on the internet. The difference here, though, was that all of these learned animals, who as well as horses would sometimes be dogs or even pigs, were, to be frank, frauds. They'd been trained deliberately by the owners to look as though they were answering correctly, but in reality all they were doing was responding to their owners' cues. And while to a layperson it might seem that there was nothing untoward going on, since they obviously trained these animals to respond to the subtlest cues they could, to anyone who knew what to look for, it was usually pretty easy to spot the telltale signs that this supposed animal genius was just performing the same trick over and over again, and that their owner was telling them exactly what to do. But Hans was different. For a start, Von Austin didn't seem to have any kind of money motive for what he was doing. He never once charged anyone to come and see Hans perform. And on top of that, Von Austin was happy for just about anyone to ask Hans questions, unlike the fraudsters, who had to be the one asking so that they could also be the one to give the animal the correct response. And it would turn out that even when Von Austin wasn't around, Hans would still respond to any questions put to him, and still seem to be just as accurate in his responses. It really did seem like Hans understood what was being asked of him, and was working out the answers for himself. Of course, plenty of people were still sceptical, and one of those skeptics was a zoologist by the name of Schillings. He first came to see Hans in mid-July 1904, and like so many others, he was sure that this was all just some kind of ruse. However, when he actually met Hans and had the opportunity to watch him perform and ask him some questions himself, he became a total believer. A lot of retellings of Hans' story completely ignore the existence of Schillings, to the point where in all my research, I couldn't even find out what his first name was. And it's strange to me because Schillings was a really key part of how Hans became so well known. I mean, for a start, he was a scientist, someone who studied animals and investigated claims for a living, and his backing lent a lot of validity to Von Austin's claims. I mean, a guy like Schillings wouldn't really be willing to stake his entire reputation on a fraud, would he? Not only that, but Schillings also devoted a lot of his time to helping exhibit Hans, and would bring in new guests every single day to watch Hans perform. Plus, it was Schillings himself who first proved that Hans could continue to answer questions correctly even when Von Austin wasn't there, and when the person asking was a total stranger, and like Von Austin, he never once made any money from this. Of course, there were still some people who continued to believe that the whole thing was a hoax, and that Schillings had either been hoodwinked by Von Austin or was actually involved in the fraud himself. But for a lot of people, especially fellow zoologists, Schillings' backing and testimony really helped lend some credibility to Hans' reputation. You see, all this went down only a few decades after Charles Darwin published his groundbreaking work on the origin of species, and it had led to a massive increase in the idea of animal intelligence and consciousness. Prior to this, Western religious dogma had maintained that animals were created as something not only completely separate from humans, but beneath them. So of course animals didn't feel human emotions or possess human intelligence. They were just created that way. But then along comes the theory of evolution, and suddenly more and more people are coming around to the idea that maybe humans and animals aren't so different. If humans and animals share a common ancestor, if humans are in fact just a species of animal, then who's to say that animals don't feel the same things as us? Who's to say that they can't be as intelligent as us? All these ideas were still exciting and new, so really it's no wonder that learned animals, as they were often called, were so popular at this time. And because Hans seemed to be the real deal, he was the most popular of all, and there seemed to be nothing that Hans couldn't do. In fact, Von Austin found that Hans seemed to be able to teach himself things, to pick up new information from all around him and work things out for himself. For example, Hans didn't speak French. That was just a fact. If you asked him a question in French, he'd ignore you, or become fidgety and anxious. And this is just one of the things that was hailed as proof that Hans's achievements were genuine. If he was just performing a trick rather than actually understanding the questions, then it wouldn't matter what language the question was in, because the key for him to stop tapping would be the same. And if this was all a fraud, then surely they'd want Hans to be able to answer questions in as many languages as possible, to make the whole thing more impressive. But he couldn't. Until one day when Schillings asked, in French, for Hans to tap twice. And he did. Well, he tapped 3 times, but it wasn't all that uncommon for Hans to be out by 1. Sometimes he'd get a little carried away and accidentally give 1 extra tap. But even if he hadn't got the answer exactly right, he'd clearly understood what was being asked of him and responded. And this was a big deal. Schillings had tried to get Hans to respond to French before, but he never had until now. And now he seemed to be able to answer anything Schillings put to him in French. So what had happened? Well, Von Austin's theory was that Hans had taught himself French from hearing it be spoken by people around him, that he'd worked it all out by himself. And certainly no one had ever deliberately taught him French, so if his achievements were real, then that kind of had to be the only explanation, short of someone sneaking into the courtyard overnight and giving him secret French lessons for some reason. So, now we have a horse who can not only read, spell, count, do maths, and any number of intellectual feats, but he can also apparently teach himself to speak foreign languages. And there were scientists and horse experts vouching for him. Is it any wonder that Hans became such an icon? And Hans really was famous. I've already mentioned that he was known as far abroad as the US, but in his home country he was a full-blown celebrity. Like, they were writing and performing songs about him, they were making children's toys of him, they were selling Clever Hans postcards for you to send to your friends, they were even using his image on liquor bottles to try and push sales. And this is all on top of the crowds of people flocking to see him in person, and countless pieces about him in German newspapers and magazines. Like, I cannot overstate how famous Clever Hans was. And obviously all of this fame meant a lot of discussions around whether or not Hans was the real deal. And in September 1904, a group of experts came together to work out once and for all what the hell was going on. This group, which would become known as the Hans Commission, consisted of 13 men, including circus manager Paul Bush, who had a career's worth of experience in training horses to perform using subtle signals, as well as school teachers and education experts, the director of Berlin Zoo, Dr. Ludwig Heck, and the zoo's assistant, Dr. Oskar Heinroth, Dr. Meisner of the Royal Veterinary College, the head of the University of Berlin's Psychological Institute, Professor Nagel, and director of the Psychological Institute, Professor Karl Stumpf. It was actually Professor Stumpf who first came up with the idea of putting together a commission to investigate Clever Hans, and his is a name you're probably going to want to remember because it's one that will come up again later. So yeah, this was a group of men who were all leaders in their respective fields, and the hope was that with their varied expertise, they would finally be able to get to the truth of what was happening with Hans, since it certainly didn't seem like he'd been trained. And Von Austin was actually really happy for the commission to study Hans. And why wouldn't he be when he was genuinely convinced of what he'd done? However, when Von Austin found out that a lot of people were still suspicious of him, he told the commission he wanted them to do all their tests without him being present. He didn't want to be involved until he'd been completely cleared of using tricks. This posed an issue for the commission though, because while Hans would answer questions from most people, if you wanted to get reliable and repeated answers from him, then he needed time to get accustomed to you first. However, it so happened that while the members of the commission were talking to Von Austin about all this, it was mentioned that Dr. Meisner had recently been to an exhibition of Clever Rosa, one of the most famous learned horses aside from Hans, and had been able to work out the methods the trainer was using to get her to perform. This caused a total 180 in Von Austin, who immediately said that he'd be willing to undergo the most stringent examination possible, and would agree to any kind of controlled conditions that the commission wanted. As far as he was concerned, he had nothing to hide. He knew he wasn't doing any tricks, and this seemed like the perfect way to prove once and for all that he wasn't a fraud. The Commission's investigation took place over 2 days, the 11th and 12th of September 1904. On both days, they put Hans through a variety of different tests and experiments in multiple different conditions to try and get to the bottom of what was actually happening. These included asking Hans questions when Von Austin couldn't be seen, or wasn't there at all, asking questions with as few people present as possible, and having one person give Hans a number before leaving the room, only for another person to come in and give him a separate number and ask him to add it to the previous one. The whole point being that the second questioner didn't know what the first number was and thus wouldn't be able to give Hans any clues, intentionally or not. And perhaps the most simple but important of these tests involved Von Austin asking Hans questions, with the entire process being watched by the Commission, who all kept their focus firmly on Von Austin. To allow them to be as precise as possible in their observations, each person was assigned one single part of Von Austin to focus on. His head, his eyes, one of his hands. with the circus trainer Bush keeping an eye on Von Austin's overall body language and behaviour, as well as that of any onlookers. The idea was that Von Austin could be, even unintentionally, giving minute signals to Hans to tell him what to do. But no matter how intently they looked, they just couldn't see anything to suggest that the answers were coming from anywhere other than Hans's own mind. Both at the time and even now, a lot of sources will claim that when the Hans Commission published the report of their findings, they said that they agreed with Von Austin, that Hans was the real deal. He really was a horse who could do all these incredible feats. But that's not actually the case. In fact, the Commission never even set out to find out if Hans's alleged intelligence was real. Instead, they had only one goal: to confirm whether or not Hans had been trained in the traditional sense of the word, and if all of this was him just performing tricks. The aim was nothing to do with Hans and more to do with Von Austin, to see if he, or anyone else for that matter, was giving Hans intentional signals to get him to give the right answers. And they found that he wasn't. Whatever was going on with Hans, it wasn't a case of deceit. Hans was not some performing pony like so many other so-called educated animals, including Clever Rosa. And the publication of this report really sent Hans's fame to the next level. Mainly because, as I said, plenty of sources misreported what had happened, claiming that this board of scientists, educators and experts had declared that Hans was indeed a genius, doing everything he was claimed to be able to do. And as a result, the crowds of people flocking to see him every single day grew in size even more. Hans's increase in popularity and the fact that he now seemingly had the scientific community's backing meant that Von Austin received several offers from people looking to buy Hans and profit off of him. The exact amounts offered have never been stated publicly, but apparently they were freaking huge. But Von Austin refused to sell Hans. It seems like Von Austin really did think of Hans as being almost like a child to him. As far as I can tell, Von Austin was never married, never had any children of his own, didn't really seem to have any family at this point in his life other than Hans. That horse was his only companion. It's sad, and when you realise that, it helps show why Von Austin was so dedicated to Hans and believed so wholeheartedly that Hans was everything he wanted him to be. And I'm realising now that I've never given a full list of Hans' alleged accomplishments. So let's do that now. So, obviously he could count, as well as perform any number of maths problems put to him. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and any number of percentages, decimals, and fractions that would almost certainly go straight over my head. He knew the value of all the German coins that were in use at that time, and if you presented him with a collection of them, he could tell you exactly how much they were worth. He'd seemingly memorised the annual calendar so well that not only could he tell you the date of the current day, but also any other day you put to him, and likewise with the days of the week. And he could combine these things. For example, when he was asked the question, if the 8th day of the month is on a Tuesday, what's the date of the following Friday? The answer to that is 11, by the way, which I had to Google, because apparently I'm less intelligent than a horse. If presented with a watch, he could tell the time from a single glance, and could answer any questions relating to time, including what the time would be based on theoretical, described clock hands. Hans could also, of course, read written German, although only if the letters were all in lowercase, as Von Austin had never taught him the capitals. And he could answer written questions, and if you presented him with several cards or signs with certain words written on them, he could pick out a specific one. He could also spell by tapping out letters, 1 for A, 2 for B, and so on, and could spell any word you put to him, including full phrases and people's names. You could gesture to a woman in the crowd with a parasol and ask Hans what she was holding, and sure enough, he'd immediately spell it out. And if you showed him a picture, he could describe what was in it. Hans was once given the phrase, "The bridge and the road are held by the enemy," to spell out. And when he was asked to recite it again the next day, he was able to do it just from memory, with no mistakes. And speaking of Hans's memory, that was another one of his feats. He only had to see someone once, and he would never forget their name or face. If you asked about someone who'd come to see him in the past, even just once, he could spell out their name without hesitation. And if you showed him a picture of someone, he'd recognise them from that as well, no matter how old the picture was, or how different they might look now. With these pictures, he would either spell out the person's name, or if they were present, he would pick them out by walking up to them. And actually, this is one of the tests that took place during the Hans Commission's investigation into him. The members stood lined up, and Hans would be shown a photo of one of them and asked to pick them out, and sure enough, he got it right every single time. He could also identify playing cards and tell you the number and house of every single one presented to him. He also had an excellent ear for music. He could recognise and identify at least 13 different pieces of music if they were played for him, and on top of that, he could also recognise any individual note played. If you played him a series of different notes, he'd tell you whether or not he liked it by nodding or shaking his head, and if he didn't like it, he'd then tell you which note to remove to make it sound better. Hans was apparently quite particular in his music taste, and in particular, he really disliked modern music, or, modern by the standards of 1904. And while we're on the subject, Hans was said to have an exceptional sense of hearing, so much so that he could correctly answer a question even if you asked it so quietly that it was barely audible. Because of this, people who came to see Hans perform were told under no circumstances to whisper the answer to a question if they worked it out before Hans did, because he'd hear it and be able to use that to cheat, no matter how quietly they breathed it or how far away they were. Similarly, Hans was also said to have outstanding eyesight. You could write a word in a script so tiny that you could barely make it out even when it was directly in front of your face, and then hold it on the far side of the courtyard, and somehow Hans could still read it clearly enough to answer. even when no human could. And this was particularly of note to scientists, because at the time at least, horses weren't thought to have very good eyesight at all. Hands could also do things like count the number of windows in distant houses, or the number of street urchins climbing about on the neighbourhood roofs, which apparently was a thing that they did back then. If you asked Hans how many people in the crowd watching him were wearing glasses, or hats, or holding umbrellas, or even how many of them were men and how many were women, he could tell you. He could also identify colours. If you laid out a series of coloured cloths and asked him to pick one out by name, he would. As well as tapping, Hans could also give answers by nodding or shaking his head, like I mentioned earlier, as well as by moving his head up, down, left or right. If someone facing Hans raised their right arm and asked him which one it was, he'd give the correct answer, even though to him it would appear as the left. And there are probably still more things that he achieved that I haven't included here, but you get the picture. He was exceptionally impressive. And in fact, he was declared to have the same level of intelligence as a 13 or 14-year-old human child. On top of all this, when Hans did get a question wrong, he would not only admit to it by shaking his head when you asked him if he'd gotten it right, but he could also tell you how many units he was off by, and then amend his response and give the right answer, usually. Sometimes Hans would be in a mood where he'd just give the wrong answer again and again, even when he'd been told it was wrong. Von Austin said that it wasn't uncommon for Hans to be stubborn, and this seemed to be particularly the case when he felt that a question was too easy or if he was fed up with someone. On a similar note, Hans was said to have a strong sense of humour, often at the expense of whichever poor person was asking him questions. As I previously mentioned, sometimes this would take the form of seemingly deliberately giving the wrong answer repeatedly, but he would also sometimes seem to give silly answers if he thought someone was asking a deliberately impossible question, or if someone asked a question that they themselves clearly didn't know the answer to. He didn't seem to be a horse who suffered fools. Although the Hans Commission had succeeded in ruling out any intentional training or cues on Von Austin's part, they still didn't think that was quite enough to say for sure that Hans really was as intelligent as his supporters claimed. Their 2-day investigation had been pretty meticulous, but they knew that if they wanted to prove once and for all what the truth behind Hans's feats were, then they needed to hold a thorough, controlled and in-depth scientific study. And the man who was chosen to head the study was a psychologist by the name of Oskar Funkst, who was a co-worker of Professor Stumpf at Berlin University's Institute of Psychology. They went into this investigation with an open mind, more than willing to have their views on the matter of animal intelligence and consciousness changed if, and only if, all other explanations for Hans's behaviour could be ruled out through proper scientific method. Although Funkst was the one heading up the investigation, he wasn't going into it alone. He received assistance from various people throughout its course, including, of course, Von Austin and Schillings, but also Professor Stumpf amongst numerous others, including more of those who'd been in the commission. Funkst got to work in October 1904. But where do you start with something like this? Well, they knew by this point that Hans definitely wasn't responding to any intentional signals from his handler, and although the Commission hadn't noticed any unintentional ones, they certainly hadn't ruled out the possibility that there were some there that were just too minute to have been seen, and that's where Funkst began. First though, in order to make this investigation scientifically sound, they had to perform it in as controlled an environment as possible. But shipping Hans off to some random laboratory wasn't really an option, so instead they went for the next best thing of erecting a massive canvas tent in the courtyard. After that, they were free to start experimenting. First, to get a baseline of Hans's correct responses, they put him through his various feats, and kept meticulous records of how often he was right versus how often he was wrong, and they found his overall success rate to be about 90%. Although it was noticeably lower in tasks where he had to go and pick up a coloured cloth, for example, than it was in cases where he was just tapping. Funkst knew that if there were some kind of involuntary signals, then Hans had to be receiving them somehow, through some sense. So he decided that the best place to start was to gradually work through each of Hans's senses, seeing if having one of them limited affected his ability to answer questions correctly. If it did, that would be a glaring red flag that he wasn't actually a mathematical genius. They had various plans as to how they were going to do this. Limiting his sight would be pretty easy, as it would be as simple as putting up a canvas screen or equipping Hans with massive blinkers. And hearing wouldn't be too hard either, as it was just a matter of fashioning some kind of earplug out of cotton wool. But what about his other senses? How do you stop a horse from being able to smell or feel or taste? Funkst decided that he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. I mean, after all, it seemed pretty out there that Hans was somehow smelling the correct answer. But in the world of scientific study, it's important to keep an open mind. Instead, he decided to begin with what would be the easiest sense to limit, his sight. And what do you know? They found out pretty quickly that if Hans couldn't see his questioner, the number of correct answers he gave dropped dramatically. They also established that Hans could only give correct answers not only if he could see the questioner, but also if the questioner knew the answer. There were some cases reported where Hans had given a correct answer despite the questioner expecting an incorrect one, only to then realise that they'd been wrong when Hans gave his answer, but pretty much all of these cases were ones in which Hans was only out by one, and like I said earlier, it wasn't all that uncommon for Hans to be out by one anyway, so in these cases the fact that Hans did get it right seems to be more just down to chance than anything else. Regardless, one thing was clear. Hans was receiving the answer from his questioner, and could only get that information if his questioner both knew it and was visible to him. And Von Austin was not impressed. Not with Funkst and his team, as you might expect, but with Hans. He'd been so convinced that he'd taught Hans to understand human language and respond accordingly that at first he was genuinely astonished that Hans seemed to lose his ability when he lost his sight, and then angry with him, sure that Hans was just being stubborn or acting up deliberately in the way he sometimes seemed to do. But they'd done it. They'd proved that Hans wasn't coming up with these answers himself, and that he didn't really understand maths or German or any of his other alleged feats. All along he'd been responding to unintentional visual cues, so case closed, right? Well, it wasn't quite that simple. First of all, they had to do various other tests to prove the link for certain, and even then they still had no idea what these unintentional cues actually were. Although fairly early on they were able to prove that these signals were definitely unintentional, as Hans responded the same way no matter who asked the question, even when none of his regular handlers like Von Austin or Schillings were there. But no matter how hard he tried, Funkst couldn't detect any kind of movement or reaction in himself that would give the answer to Hans. But clearly he was doing it somehow. What followed was a series of incredibly in-depth tests and experiments, both to debunk Hans's alleged intelligence, but also to try and work out what it actually was that he was reacting to. Before any of the more difficult or complex tests, Von Austin would refuse to allow things to proceed until he'd explained to Hans what was required of him and received a nod from Hans to indicate that he understood. But as I said, Hans couldn't get the answers right if he couldn't see his questioner, or if the questioner didn't know the answer themselves, which meant it wasn't uncommon for Hans to nod, seemingly understanding what was wanted of him, only to immediately disgrace himself during the actual test. It was almost like he didn't understand any of what was said to him. One thing they learnt very early on was that Hans didn't need any kind of audio cue to perform. You didn't have to ask him a question out loud. You could just say it in your head, and he'd start tapping it and give as accurate a response as though you'd said it directly into his ear. Another piece of evidence that he didn't actually understand the questions being asked of him. After some pretty extensive investigation, Funkst managed to spot the subtle changes in the questioner's position that got Hans to respond. Firstly, as I mentioned, Hans didn't need any words to be spoken in order to start tapping. In fact, they found that he responded very little to sounds in general. Far less than you'd actually expect from a horse. So what did clue him in that it was time to start counting? Well, it was found that whenever someone gave Hans a question, once they'd finished speaking, they'd then lean forwards ever so slightly to get a better look at Hans's hoof while he tapped, as the questioner would typically stand to Hans's left side, and Von Austin had trained him to always tap with his right leg. Not only that, but one thing that was often used as evidence that Hans was legit was that when the answer was a larger number, he would begin tapping much more quickly than if it was a lower number, as if he knew that he had a lot to get through and wanted to do it as quickly as possible. Eventually, though, Funkst realised that actually when people were expecting a bigger number, they, again, without realising, would lean forward slightly further, and the speed of Hans's tapping was tied entirely to the angle of the questioner. If he straightened up slightly while Hans was tapping, he'd slow down, and if he leant further forward, he'd speed up again. They also eventually managed to discover possibly the most important signal of all, the one that told Hans he'd got the correct answer and caused him to stop tapping. So it turns out that once the questioner had counted the correct number of taps, their head would jerk upwards. Again, this movement was incredibly slight. Not noticeable either to the person doing it or to any onlookers, unless you were staring intently at someone for hours and hours at a time, over the course of several days, trying your hardest to detect something, which most people wouldn't do, but Funkst did. And he actually first noticed this movement in Von Austin and not in himself. It was such a slight movement that even when you were the one to do it, you didn't even notice you'd done it. These responses were so instinctive and automatic that even once he was aware of them, Funkst struggled to control them, but on the occasions when he was able to prove that Hans's correct responses came entirely from that head jerk. If you asked Hans a question and continued standing bolt upright instead of leaning forwards, then Hans wouldn't react at all. And once you'd learnt to give these signals intentionally, you could get Hans to stop counting whenever you wanted. Funkst found out that you didn't even need to have a question for Hans to answer. You'd give the same involuntary head jerk just by focusing enough on a certain number. So it turns out that every single one of Hans's feats that was accomplished through tapping was just a matter of the questioner's posture. Through their experimentation, they made other discoveries too. Hans would almost exclusively base his responses on the questioner, ignoring anyone else present. But if the questioner wasn't visible and other people were, or if the questioner really wasn't giving anything away, then Hans would sometimes instead focus on responding to the body language of someone else present, especially if they were standing close to the questioner. They attempted to measure how much someone's head actually moved to give Hans the signal to stop when he'd reached the right number, and they found that in the case of Von Austin, whose head jerk was always the slightest, his head moved as little as 1/5 of a millimetre. That's practically nothing, but Hans was tuned into him enough to pick up on it. Other people's head jerks were more noticeable, but even so, the average of everyone they examined was only about 1 millimetre. No wonder no one had noticed it before. It also helped though that Von Austin pretty much always wore this big black slouch hat with a wide brim, which would have made his head movements slightly more visible to Hans, although they were still so slight that most people would never even notice. And although it might sound a bit suspicious, there's nothing to suggest that he wore this hat with the intention of helping Hans. He didn't even seem to know that's what it did. It was, by all accounts, just a fashion choice. Actually, throughout all of this, Funkst, Stumpf, and the other experts who investigated this case all maintained that Von Austin was entirely innocent, and had absolutely no idea that Hans wasn't actually capable of the things he appeared to be. He was just a guy so convinced of his own theory that it didn't even occur to him that there might be some other explanation. Like I said, he was genuinely shocked when Hans started getting questions wrong after he had blinders put on him. Okay, so by working out the cause of the tapping, that's debunked the vast majority of Hans's alleged achievements. But what about the other ones? His ability to pick out a placard with a certain word on it, or a cloth of a certain colour, or his ability to answer questions with head movements. They were a little harder to debunk, but with enough experimentation and studying, Funks was able to get to the bottom of these too. Hans's ability to pick out placards and coloured cloths was one of his less successful abilities anyway. I mean, don't get me wrong, he still got the answers right far more often than you'd expect from a non-human animal, and far more than random chance. It was still about 80%, but that was still noticeably lower than his success rate when it came to questions which he answered through tapping. And eventually, Funks began to notice a pattern. Hans had a noticeably higher success rate when the desired colour was at the very end of the row, rather than when it was in the middle. Plus, he was better at selecting the correct cloth when there were less of them and they were spaced further apart. Once he started adding more in, or reducing the distances between them, he began to struggle much more. It turns out that this came from the fact that when you wanted Hans to get a certain colour, you would, of course, look at that cloth, because, I mean, where else are you going to look? You want to see if he gets it right. And it was this that gave him the signal. He could tell from the direction someone was facing what colour they wanted. That's why it was easier for him to work it out if the colour was on the end of the row, because it was more obvious than if someone was looking at the centre of the row where there were several potential options. That's also why it was harder when the cloths were closer together. It was much more difficult for him to work out which one the questioner was actually focusing on. This degree of visual perception had never been documented in horses before. I don't think it had been documented in any animal. And even some of Germany's leading equine experts struggled to believe that such a thing was possible, but Funk's evidence was undeniable. During these kinds of tests, Von Austin would also typically give Hans a slightly more intentional helping hand. If Hans was heading towards the wrong colour, just before he picked it up, Von Austin would call out to him to correct him. And Hans would then move on to the next colour, which was usually the right one, as he was pretty good at getting at least the general direction correct. And Von Austin didn't view this as, cheating or anything. As far as he was concerned, letting Hans know when he'd got it wrong was an important part of his education. But Funks discovered that it didn't actually matter what you shouted out to him, just as long as you shouted something. You could tell Hans that he'd got it right, and he'd still drop the cloth and move along to the next one. Another nail in the coffin for Hans being able to understand basically anything coming out of a person's mouth. And the logic behind Hans's colour selection was the same as his ability to pick out words written on cards or an individual person present. He'd just follow where the questioner was looking. If you weren't facing him at all, he had no clue what to do. So all that's really left to debunk is Hans's ability to communicate by nodding and shaking his head and answering questions by pointing in different directions with his head. Well, it turned out that most of the time, again, with no clue that they were doing it, the questioner would move their head ever so slightly in the direction they wanted, and Hans would respond by basically just copying them, but in a bigger, more obvious motion. Sometimes, though, it wouldn't even be their head moving. It would just be a momentary flicker of their eyes, and still, Hans was able to pick up on this and react accordingly. Hans may not have been a genius in the way his supporters had claimed, but it's clear that he was still an incredibly intelligent animal to be able to pick up on all of these minute movements and know how he was expected to respond. He was basically cold-reading people in the same way that sidekicks do. And his questioners and all these hundreds, if not thousands of spectators he'd had never once picked up on these clues, they were so subtle. But, okay, if this was all it was, then why would Hans sometimes keep giving the wrong answer? I mean, if the questioner knew the right answer, then Hans should have been able to read their body language for it, right? Well, it turns out this would happen in cases where the person ended up subconsciously expecting Hans to mess up. They were focusing more on the wrong answer he'd just given than the correct one that they wanted. And so they were given these unintentional signals at the wrong time, and Hans was just doing what he always did. He wasn't being deliberately stubborn or teasing people the way Von Austin thought. The poor horse was just trying his best to give the person the answer he thought they wanted, the one they were telling him they wanted. Funk's study into Hans's responses was extensive and went on for over a month, during which time they would be there multiple times a week for an average of about 4 hours a day. Both Funks and Schillings were bitten by Hans on multiple occasions when he just got fed up with them, and Hans wasn't the only one who was souring to them. At one point, when Von Austin wanted to give an example of Hans's head nodding and shaking abilities, he did it by asking Hans if he liked Mr. Bush, the circus trainer, and Hans nodded. Then he asked Hans if he liked Mr. Funkst, and Hans responded by shaking his head. But we know that Hans didn't actually understand the questions being asked of him, and therefore could only echo the answer his questioner wanted. Hans wasn't the one who disliked Funkst, Von Austin was. And for some reason this is just hilarious to me. Imagine telling someone you don't like them through the medium of a trained animal. Genuinely iconic. And I mean, by all accounts, Hans actually really liked Funkst, despite the biting incidents. They spent a lot of time together over the course of the study, and of course, Funkst would reward Hans with carrots every time he got an answer right. And not only that, but unlike Von Austin, Funkst would never reprimand Hans for getting questions wrong. Do you remember how earlier I said that Hans couldn't read capital letters, and how for a long time he couldn't understand French? That was often used as proof that Hans's abilities were real. If he was being handed the answers, well, the person asking the question could read capital letters, and if they knew enough French to ask Hans a question in it, then they'd also know the answer too. And yet in both of these cases, Hans wouldn't reply. He'd just stare at you blankly. Surely such gaps in his knowledge were evidence that at least some of this was real? Well, no. Funks managed to explain this too. Like I said, Hans didn't really respond at all to verbal cues. When he began tapping, it was because he could tell from someone's body language that they wanted a response. Well, if you ask a question and you're not expecting a response, then your body language is different and you wouldn't give Hans a signal to tap. That's why Hans suddenly seemed to learn French out of nowhere. One day, without even giving it much thought, Schillings happened to give Hans a command in French in a particularly strong, expectant manner, and Hans picked up on his body language, which was different to the unexpectant body language he would usually give when he asked Hans a question in French. And after that, people just expected him to understand French, and their body language reflected that. It was literally a case of Hans not being able to do something because people didn't believe he could. Eventually, Funks and his team felt they'd learned enough from Hans for now, but their work wasn't over yet. Funks wanted to learn more about these unintentional signals, and so starting in November 1904, he began a series of tests in his home base, the labs of the University of Berlin's Psychological Institute. He wanted to see if these unintentional signals that Hans was being given were something that most people did, or if they were just some weird, horse-based blip. But as I said, they couldn't get Hans into a lab, so what did they do instead? Well, because a good scientist will do anything in the pursuit of knowledge, Funks himself took the role of horse. When I first heard about this, I fully pictured him on all fours on the lab floor, stamping his foot, and as hilarious of a mental image that is, it turned out that he was actually just standing or sitting in a normal position and using his hand to tap, which, to be fair, is probably more practical and certainly more dignified, but I would have loved it if he'd fully committed to the bit. As part of the study, they brought in 25 people, male and female, representing a range of ages, professions, nationalities, and all clueless about what the point of this experiment actually was. The youngest person they brought into this was only 5 or 6 years old. It was pretty simple. They were told to think of a number, and then Funks would begin tapping until he saw the same cues that would cause Hans to stop. And he found that all but 2 of the people involved in the study gave some kind of involuntary signal when he hit the right number, and not one of them was aware that they were doing it. As with Hans, they eventually moved on to maths instead of individual numbers, and when it came to addition, Funks could not only get the correct total number, but he could also tell how they'd phrased it in their mind, which numbers they'd used, and which order they'd put them in, because they'd give these even smaller reactions when he got the first number right. And actually this echoes one of Hans's common mistakes, where he'd be asked to add 2 numbers together, but would just tap out the first one given to him. They did other tests too, where to simulate Hans moving his head in a certain direction, they would assign each direction a specific word that was completely unrelated. The test subject would select one of these words, and when given the signal, they would start focusing on it, and Funks would then move his arm in whichever direction. In fact, once he'd done it a few times with someone, he could actually then begin to predict the word they'd chosen before they'd even had the signal to focus on it properly. And in one case, he could tell that someone was initially going to go with one word before at the last minute changing their mind and focusing on a different one. Even when someone wasn't properly focusing on this word, they could still give it away with a slight flicker of the eyes. All in all, the laboratory tests fully confirmed Funks' observations with Hans, and he decided to finally publish the findings of his investigation. He wanted to be able to do some more tests on Hans and experiment further, but after learning of the study's results, Von Austin refused to let them work with Hans again, and he also just fully refused to accept the findings, despite the mountain of evidence in their favour. He continued to exhibit Hans as he always had done, and people continued to come, although at least some of them came just to see if they could spot those subtle little movements. Like I said in the beginning of this episode, Funks would go on to write a book detailing the clever Hans investigation and all of their incredibly detailed experiments and results. It was my primary source for this episode, and of course I'll have a link down below if you want to give it a read yourself, but like I said, it's quite dense in some places. So now you're probably wondering, what happened to Hans after all of this? Well, with the truth now out there, his fame slowly but surely dwindled. Going to see a horse read body language just wasn't as exciting as going to see a horse do maths and write sentences. Vilhelm Von Austin passed away in 1909, and although we don't know exactly what happened to Hans after this, what we do know is that it's not a happy ending. He seems to have gone through multiple owners until 1914, when the First World War broke out and Hans was drafted as a military horse. Over the course of the war, an estimated 6 million horses were called up for military service, and unfortunately, the vast majority of them would never come home. All we know is that Hans died in 1916, either killed on the battlefield or eaten by soldiers. It's an utterly tragic end for such an incredible animal, and I'm genuinely sorry that the story has such a sad ending. But in a way, Hans lives on, not only through his story, but also in what's become known as the clever Hans phenomenon, which refers to the unintentional signals he was being given. The clever Hans phenomenon has been used to create guidelines for the scientific study of animals who are claimed to either be able to talk or perform other incredible feats. And in fact, it's been found that a lot of these so-called talking or educated animals have actually just been the result of the clever Hans effect. It's even been discovered that police sniffer dogs will sometimes give a positive signal for something, not because there's anything actually there, but because their owners expect for there to be, which, as you can imagine, has some quite broad implications for court cases that rely on police sniffer dog evidence. Speaking of which, there are actually a couple of high-profile cases of sniffer dog drama that I really want to make an episode about that go far deeper than just the clever hands phenomenon, but I'm not going to get into that now. You should subscribe to the podcast though, because those cases are wild. Trust me, you do not want to miss them. And yeah, that's the story of clever hands. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was a little lighter than my previous episode. It's kind of the mirror image of it. Thandy's story had a tragic beginning and a positive end, while this was light-hearted right up until the end. I know this episode has been pretty long. I absolutely did not expect it to be such a beast getting into it, especially when I first started researching and every article I could find was basically just the same cookie-cutter information with the same basic facts and nothing more. But then I discovered Oscar Funk's book, and it had so much information in it that wasn't included anywhere else, and I really wanted to be able to tell the story in a more original way than most other coverage of it. Another thing that I really wanted to try and do was to focus a bit more on Hans as an individual, because most coverage of his story doesn't really tell you much about him at all. Anyone who's ever worked with or cared for horses in any capacity can tell you how unique they all are, how each one has a complex personality and their own individual quirks. But most articles only focus on what Hans did and not who he was and what he was like outside of his tapping. That's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed being able to source most of my research from Funk's book on the case. Someone who actually knew Hans and worked closely with him. You can tell from the way he writes about Hans that he still really liked him, even when it became clear that Hans wasn't capable of maths and all that. He talks in his book about how animals still deserve respect and care even if they don't have the cognitive abilities of a human. And he shares little anecdotes here and there about Hans's personality and quirks, and I really hope that I managed to sort of also give a sense for who Hans was outside of his computing abilities. So yeah, thank you again so much for listening to this week's episode. New episodes of the Animal Nerd podcast come out every single Tuesday, so if you enjoyed it then please do subscribe so you never miss an episode. I have a lot of ideas for future content and I'm really excited to share them with you. Some of them are really cool. All of our social medias, our website, email address will all be in the show notes, as will a link to all of the sources used in this episode. And yeah, thanks again for joining me here today, and I will see you next Tuesday. Stay wild, friends!